My children sold my home before I was even gone.
There is a kind of cold that does not announce itself. It does not howl or crack or press against the windows with any drama. It simply arrives, settles into the bones of a place, and waits. The cold that came to Harlan Falls, Colorado on the third Tuesday of December came exactly like that. Quiet, patient, final. Marion Cole was in the backyard when she first understood something was wrong. Not that Tuesday, 3 months before it. She was trimming the apple tree along the back fence, the same tree Harold had planted the spring. Their daughter Penny turned 2, the same tree that had never once failed to give fruit in 38 years. The pruning shears were old, the handles wrapped in electrical tape, where the grip had cracked, and Marion worked with the deliberate care of a woman who had learned long ago that things maintain themselves only if you showed up for them consistently and without complaint. She heard the car before she saw it. A sound she knew the way you know the voices of people you love or the voices of people you have learned to watch carefully. The engine of Garrett's black SUV had a particular weight to it, something solid and self-satisfied, like the man himself. But Garrett never came on Tuesdays. In 45 years of life, her son had arranged his world around convenience, and Tuesday afternoons held no convenience for him here. Marion did not put down the shears. She kept working, listening, and when she heard the second car door open, the one that did not belong to Garrett or Diane, she understood that whatever this was, it had been planned. She came around the corner of the house slowly. Garrett stood at the front gate with a man she had never seen before, a man in a charcoal suit who was looking at the house the way you look at something you are already measuring for replacement. Not admiring, assessing. The man had a leather portfolio under one arm, and he was speaking to Garrett in a low voice with the casual authority of someone accustomed to being listened to. Garrett saw her and smiled. It was the smile she had come to recognize over the past 2 years, the one that arrived slightly too quickly and departed slightly too late. The smile of a man managing a situation rather than living inside it. She asked who the man was. Garrett said he was an old colleague just passing through, thought he would stop and see the place. The man in the suit nodded and extended his hand and gave a name she would not remember later because she was not listening to his name. She was listening to the way he had looked at her house, and she was watching Garrett watch her. That night, she lay in bed and tried to remember if she had signed anything recently that she had not fully read, and she remembered. 4 months before that afternoon, Garrett had arrived with a folder of papers thick and divided with colored tabs, the kind of paperwork that signals a process already in motion. He had sat across from her at the kitchen table and explained it in the tone he used when he wanted her to feel cared for rather than informed. It was a financial power of attorney, he said, standard protection for someone her age. If something happened to her, a fallen illness, anything sudden, he would be able to handle the accounts, the property, the decisions that could not wait for her recovery. He had said it was what responsible families did. He had said Dad would have wanted this. She had signed because she trusted him. She had signed because she was tired in a way that had accumulated over 14 years of keeping everything running alone after Harold died. And tired people sometimes choose to believe that the people they love are acting from love. She had signed because the alternative, sitting with the suspicion that her own son was building a document trail against her, required a kind of grief she was not ready for. Now lying in the dark 3 months later, the memory of that folder sat in her chest like a stone. Harold Cole had been a carpenter by trade and a quiet man by nature. He had built the house on Maplewood Ridge himself over 3 summers, working evenings and weekends, measuring twice for every cut, never rushing a joint or skipping a step in the finish work. When he drove the last nail into the front porch railing in the autumn of 1984, he had turned to Marion and said without ceremony or sentiment that the thing would outlast them both if they maintained it. It was not a romantic statement. It was a promise spoken in the language of a man who believed in the integrity of what he built. Harold died of a heart attack 14 years ago. No warning, no decline, no time to say the things you imagine you would say if you knew. Marion had stood in a hospital hallway at 2 in the morning and understood in a single moment that every assumption she had made about the shape of her remaining life was no longer accurate. She did not grieve loudly. There was too much to manage. Garrett was 31 and had just started his real estate business with $40,000 from Harold's life insurance money. Marion had handed over without hesitation because he had said he only needed it once, and she believed him. Penny was 26 and angry at the world in the undirected way of someone who has just lost a parent and does not yet know how to carry it. Marion worked extra shifts at the county library, cataloged archives late into the evenings, sold Harold's workshop tools over the course of 2 years, and kept the house. She kept the house because it was the last thing Harold had built, and because keeping it felt like keeping a promise to him, even though he was not there to know she was keeping it. She thought about all of this standing at the kitchen sink 2 weeks after seeing the man in the charcoal suit when her neighbor Ruth Demby knocked on the back door without calling ahead, which Ruth never did, unless it was something she did not want to say over the phone. Ruth was 70 years old and had spent 20 years as a county nurse before retiring, which meant she had a clinical directness that some people found abrasive, and Marion had always found like clean water. Ruth came inside, accepted the cup of coffee Marion poured without being asked, and said she had something to tell her. 3 days earlier, while Marion was at her volunteer shift at the library, a group of men had come to the property. Not to the door. They had stood outside the fence with measuring equipment and a set of plans, and one of them Ruth said she recognized. His name was Warren Stills. He ran a development company out of Denver called Stonecrest Group, and he had spent the past 5 years buying up properties along the western slope of the valley, always from older owners, always at prices Ruth described with a flat precision as beneath what the land was worth. Marion listened without interrupting. Ruth set down her coffee cup. She said she did not know exactly what Garrett had done or what he was planning, but she knew Warren Stills did not drive 2 hours from Denver to stand outside someone's fence and look at their house for pleasure. Then Ruth said, "Before you talk to Garrett about any of this, find out whether a contract has already been signed." Marion heard it. She heard the specific weight Ruth put on the word already. She drove to Garrett's office the following afternoon. It was a Tuesday, which she had begun to think of differently now. Garrett was with a client when she arrived and made her wait 20 minutes in the reception area, which she understood was not carelessness, but communication. When he finally came out and closed the glass door behind him, he was wearing the professional smile, the one calibrated for reassurance. He gestured toward his office. She stayed where she was. She asked him directly, "What is Warren Stills doing measuring the property?" Something passed through Garrett's expression quickly, too quickly to name with certainty, and then it was gone, replaced by a version of patience that was indistinguishable from condescension if you were not paying close attention. He said Warren was an associate. He said they had discussed the property in general terms, nothing formal, nothing decided. He said the house was getting too large for her to manage alone, and he had been thinking about what made sense going forward, what was practical, what was responsible. Marion looked at her son for a long moment. She had looked at his face across thousands of tables in hundreds of rooms, through every version of himself he had cycled through since childhood, and she recognized with a clarity that required no drama that she was not speaking to her son right now. She was speaking to a man who had made a decision and was working backward through the conversation toward a conclusion already reached. She asked him again, "Has a contract been signed?" Garrett held her gaze for exactly one beat too long before saying that nothing was final, that he was looking out for her, that this was what families did. She drove home. She did not tell Ruth what had been said. She did not call Penny, though she considered it briefly, her hand resting on the phone for a moment before she put it down. She started paying close attention to small things, the way Diane had gone quiet at the last Sunday dinner whenever the house came up in conversation. The way Penny's calls had grown shorter and less frequent over the past 4 months, not the natural fade of a busy life, but the specific brevity of someone avoiding a subject. The way Garrett had started using her first name in conversation instead of mom, a shift so gradual she had not noticed it until she heard it with new ears. She understood, in the way you understand a sentence only after you have read to the end of it, that this had been in motion for longer than she had seen. On the evening of December's third Tuesday, Garrett and Diane arrived together. It was 7 in the evening. Marion was washing dishes. Garrett set a folder on the kitchen table. Inside was the completed sale contract for the house at Maplewood Ridge, executed under the authority of the financial power of attorney she had signed 4 months ago. The buyer was Stonecrest Group. Transfer of possession was scheduled for 8 the following morning. He also placed a white envelope on top of the folder. $200 in cash and the address of a motel on the highway outside of town. Marion dried her hands on the dish towel. She did not pick up the envelope. She picked up the sale contract and read the first page slowly while the kitchen was silent, except for the sound of Diane shifting her weight somewhere behind Garrett. Then Penny called. Garrett's phone lit up on the counter. He glanced at it, answered it, and said 2 words into the receiver, "Done now." Then he ended the call and put the phone back in his pocket. It was those 2 words that completed something in Marion's understanding. Not the contract, which was a document. Not the envelope, which was an insult. The 2 words spoken with the flat efficiency of a transaction confirmed told her that Penny had known. Not learned tonight, not been informed after the fact. Had known, had been waiting for the call, had been part of the structure of this. Marion set the contract down on the table. She asked in a voice that surprised her with its steadiness whether her children had anything they wanted to say to her. Garrett said she had agreed to this. He said the motel was comfortable, and he had already arranged for her things to be packed and stored. He said it was the right decision. Diane said nothing. She was looking at a point somewhere past Marion's left shoulder. Marion took her coat from the hook by the back door. She picked up her keys, which had a small flashlight attached to the ring, a gift from Harold in 1991. A practical man's practical gesture, his way of saying that a woman alone at night should have light available without having to search for it. She put on the coat. She walked out the back door. She stood on the porch Harold had built and heard the lock turn behind her. The temperature was 12 below zero. She could feel it against her face immediately, a kind of cold that did not negotiate. She stood there for a moment, not from indecision, but from the need to understand something before she moved. If she walked toward a town, toward the highway, toward the motel address on that envelope, she would be accepting a particular story. The story where she was the old woman who had been managed and settled and placed somewhere appropriate by children who knew better. That story would follow her. It would be the story Garrett told. It would become the only version available because she would have walked into it of her own feet. She turned and walked in the other direction. The road at the edge of the property ran south for a quarter mile before the pavement ended and the gravel trail began that led into the base of the western slope. Marion had walked that trail dozens of times over the years, with Harold in better decades when walking together in the evenings was the kind of ordinary thing you did not know you were memorizing. She knew the terrain well enough to trust her feet in the dark. She walked for a long time. The cold was serious now, not merely uncomfortable, but insistent, pressing through her coat in ways that required attention. She had nothing with her except the clothes she was wearing, a change of socks stuffed in her coat pocket from that morning, and a half-empty water bottle from her car, and the small flashlight on her keychain, which was throwing a narrow beam of pale yellow light at the ground 3 feet ahead of her. The trail climbed. Her legs knew the angle of it, the way they know any path walked often enough. But higher on the slope above the tree line, the trail gave way to bare rock, and she was navigating by the flashlight alone, now moving toward a darkness that offered nothing familiar. Her left foot went out from under her without warning. The sound she made was not a scream, but a short, involuntary exhale. And then she was sliding down a steep grade of loose shale, her hands scrabbling for purchase on the rock, and finding only the cold edge of nothing until she hit a natural shelf of stone and stopped. She lay still for a moment. The flashlight had landed 2 feet away, still lit, pointing sideways at the rock face beside her. She pulled herself to sitting. Her right knee throbbed, bruised but not broken. Her palms were scraped open on the shale. She reached for the flashlight and aimed it slowly around the area, orienting herself. The beam caught an opening in the rock face below the shelf where she had landed. A shadow that was not quite a shadow. She moved the light back to it and held it there. It was an entrance, low and partially hidden by a growth of mountain shrubs pressed flat by winter, but real and deliberate in the way that nature rarely is. A cave, she understood slowly, and deeper than it appeared from the outside. She had no good options. She was bleeding from both palms. The temperature was dropping, and she was alone on a mountain at night with a flashlight the size of her fist. The entrance to the cave was not safe in any conventional sense, but conventional sense had stopped being relevant approximately 3 hours ago. She got to her feet, steadied herself against the rock, and went inside. The air changed the moment she cleared the entrance. Still cold but static without the knife edge of the wind. The flashlight showed rough stone walls narrowing into a passage that curved to the left and disappeared. She moved forward carefully, testing each step, one hand against the wall for balance. The passage widened after 20 feet, then narrowed again, then opened without warning into a space large enough to stand upright in. She swept the flashlight in a slow arc. The cave was not empty, not naturally, not randomly occupied. Along the far wall, items had been arranged with the deliberateness of intention. A wooden box, its surface dark with age and cracked along the grain, a rusted lantern with a cracked glass chimney, fragments of heavy cloth that had once been something practical, and on the ground against the wall, a stack of leather-bound books, their covers worn to a color between brown and black, their edges soft with time. Marion stood in the center of the space and breathed. Her hands were bleeding onto the front of her coat. Her knee was beginning to stiffen. Outside, the temperature was dropping toward numbers that killed people. She crossed to the far wall slowly. She saw the name before she saw anything else. Above the low passage that led into a second deeper space, cut into the stone was something sharp and deliberate, two words, Elias Cole. The cut was old, deep enough that time had not softened it past recognition. Not scratched, but carved the letters formed with patience rather than urgency. Marion reached up and pressed her fingers against the letters. Cole, her husband's name, her children's name, her name, the one she had taken 38 years ago and worn with more care than anyone had ever seemed to notice. Harold had told her once that his grandfather's family had come to Colorado from Ohio in the late 19th century. He had told her the way people mention family history when it is interesting but not urgent, a piece of the past that explains nothing in particular about the present. He had not known much beyond that. Neither had she, and she had never thought to ask more. She stood with her fingers on the letters in the stone and tried to understand what she was touching. She could not understand it yet. Not fully. She had too little information and too much cold and too many hours of the worst kind of grief pressing on her from behind. But something had shifted quietly and with the weight of something real. She was not the first person named Cole to take shelter here. She lowered her hand. She picked up the topmost of the leather-bound books carefully, the way you handle something that has survived longer than anyone expected anything to survive, and held it in both hands. The cover gave slightly under her grip, soft with age but intact. She opened it. The handwriting on the first page was small and even the ink faded to the color of old tea. A name at the top followed by a date, Josephine Whitaker. October 1871. Marion closed the book gently. She sat down on the cold stone floor with her back against the wall and the stack of journals beside her, and the name Elias Cole above the passage, and the ruins of her previous life waiting somewhere behind her in the dark. She was bleeding. She was cold. She was alone in a cave in the Colorado mountains on a Tuesday night in December with no plan and no destination and no one who was going to come looking for her. But she was not in the motel on the highway, and the story of what happened next was still hers to write. The first thing Marion learned about anger was that it had its own schedule. She had expected grief. She had lived with grief before, knew its particular weight, knew how it arrived in the morning before full consciousness, and settled in for the day without asking permission. But grief was not what came to her in those first weeks inside the mountain. What came instead was something hotter and less cooperative, something that did not want to be examined or managed or transformed into meaning. It simply wanted to burn. She was angry at Garrett with a specificity that surprised her. Not at the act of it, though the act was bad enough, but at the preparation. The months of arrangement, the colored tabs in the folder, the deliberate positioning of the motel address as if she were a problem being solved rather than a person being discarded. She was angry that he had used Harold's name to get her to sign that he had said Dad would have wanted this, because Harold had built that house with his own hands. And the idea that Harold would have wanted it sold to a Denver developer for leverage in his son's business dealings was a lie so complete it required a particular kind of contempt to tell. She was angry at Diane for the studied silence. That was its own category of wrong. The silence of someone who has decided that not speaking is a form of innocence. And she was angry at Penny in a way that was different from the other two, heavier and less clean, because Penny was not calculating the way Garrett was calculating. Penny was afraid. Marion understood that. She had watched her daughter navigate the world through the avoidance of conflict her entire adult life, always finding the path that asked the least of her. The call that night, the two words Garrett had spoken into the phone with the flat efficiency of a transaction, confirmed, told Marion that Penny had been waiting for news rather than making a choice. But waiting was a choice. Saying nothing was a choice. Picking up the phone 2 days later to ask if her mother was all right would also have been a choice, and Penny had not made that one either. Marion let the anger run. She did not try to convert it into something more useful. For the first 2 weeks, she simply survived, gathered water from the seep along the inner wall, kept the cold manageable. The crackers she had found in her coat pocket on the second day and was furious. It turned out that fury was not the worst fuel for staying alive. It kept her moving when moving was hard. It kept her from the particular stillness that cold and exhaustion and despair could produce. Together, the stillness that stopped becoming rest and started becoming something else. On the 15th day, she opened the second journal. Outside the cave, the calendar was moving without her. Ruth Denby had filed a missing person report with the Harlan Falls Sheriff's Office on the fourth morning after Marion's disappearance. There had been a search, 3 days of volunteers on the marked trails, a helicopter pass over the eastern slope flyers, with Marion's photograph printed in black and white on copy paper and stapled to bulletin boards and telephone poles along the main road. The photograph was 8 years old. In it, she was standing in the backyard garden, in summer squinting slightly against the light, her expression caught between a smile and something more private. The flyer said missing at the top. They said 72 years old. They gave a phone number. After 3 weeks, the sheriff's office closed the active search. No evidence of foul play, no body, no confirmed sightings. The official conclusion offered with the careful language of a department that had seen elderly people wander before was that Marion Cole had likely left the area voluntarily or had suffered a medical event in an isolated location. Both possibilities were presented as equally plausible. Neither required further action. Garrett had spoken to the investigators twice. His answers were consistent and delivered with the measured sorrow of a concerned son who had tried to provide for his mother and been surprised by her reaction. He said she had seemed disoriented in recent months. He said the transition to a smaller living arrangement had perhaps been harder for her to accept than he had anticipated. He said he hoped she was safe somewhere and that he took comfort in the belief that she had found a place that suited her better. Ruth Denby had been in the room for the second conversation. She had listened to every word without interrupting. When Garrett finished, she had looked at the deputy handling the case and said that she had known Marion Cole for 22 years and that the woman she knew did not become disoriented and did not wander and did not leave without saying something to someone. The deputy had written this down. Nothing had changed. After the search ended, Ruth had stood in her kitchen for a long time with the coffee going cold on the counter. Then she had done the things she always did when a situation required more information than she currently had. She had started asking questions of the people who had not been officially asked. In the cave, Marion was reading about a woman named Josephine. The second journal picked up in the spring of 1873, 2 years after the first one had ended. Josephine Whitaker wrote in the practical, observational voice of someone recording events for future usefulness rather than present emotion. She described the weather with the precision of a person whose survival depended on accurate weather assessment. She described food stores and their depletion with the same precision. She described her children, 3 of them, with a directness that was not cold but was utterly without sentimentality, noting their capabilities and their failures with equal attention. What Josephine did not write about directly, but what became visible in the spaces between the practical observations, was the strain of keeping a family alive in a place that required everything from everyone, all the time without offering much in return. The journals documented a life that had almost no margin. A bad winter meant genuine scarcity. An injury to Thomas meant Josephine doing 2 people's work without acknowledgement, because acknowledgement was a luxury the situation could not afford. Marion read slowly, taking her time with the faded ink occasionally holding the pages at an angle to catch the light from the cave entrance. She recognized something in Josephine's voice. Not the circumstances, but the underlying posture. The posture of a woman who had organized her existence entirely around what was needed rather than what she wanted, who had become so fluent in necessity that she had gradually lost access to the vocabulary of her own preferences. She set the journal down at the end of the 4th day of reading and sat with that recognition for a while. Outside, Ruth Denby was knocking on doors. She had started with the neighbors nearest to the Maplewood Ridge property, then worked outward in rough, concentric circles, talking to anyone who had known Marion, or who had seen anything in the days before or after her disappearance. Most people remembered Marion as pleasant and capable, and not someone who caused concern. A few had seen the Stonecrest Group vehicles on the property in the weeks before she vanished. One man who walked his dog on the Ridge Road every morning had noticed Garrett and a man in a suit standing at the front gate looking at the house from the outside, and the way he described it matched exactly what Marion had seen from the backyard. Ruth wrote all of it down in a spiral notebook she kept in her coat pocket. Then Garrett came to see her. He arrived on a Thursday morning without calling, which Ruth understood was not an oversight. He stood in her living room with his hands in his jacket pockets and his expression set to something between concern and authority, and he told her that he appreciated her loyalty to his mother, but that her ongoing inquiries were causing distress to the family at an already difficult time. He said the investigators had done their job. He said dwelling on the situation was not helping anyone. Ruth looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Your mother did not leave that house on her own terms." Garrett said he understood she believed that. Ruth said, "I am not talking about belief. I am talking about what I know about Marion Cole and what does not fit the story you have been telling people." Garrett said gently that grief sometimes made it difficult to accept difficult realities. He said this in a tone that was so carefully calibrated towards sympathy that Ruth understood it was a warning dressed as compassion. Then he thanked her for the time and left. Ruth stood at her window and watched his car pull away. She picked up her spiral notebook and wrote down the date and the time and exactly what he had said in the exact tone in which he had said it. She did not stop asking questions. In the cave, the anger was beginning to change. It did not disappear. Marion was not the kind of woman who resolved her grief cleanly or moved through emotional stages in the tidy sequence that books suggested was available. But around the fourth week, something else began to share space with the anger, something quieter and less directed. She had finished the second journal and was halfway through the third, and she had begun to understand that she was reading something that had been waiting here specifically, in this specific cold and dark, for someone to find it. The third journal was Thomas Whitaker's. Thomas wrote differently from his wife. Where Josephine's voice was spare and empirical, Thomas wrote with the expansiveness of a man who believed that what happened to him was significant and that the record of it would matter to someone someday. He described the mountains with the wonder of a person who had grown up on flat Ohio farmland and had never quite adjusted to vertical geography. He described the work of building in this place with a craftsman's attention to material and method. And in the entries from the winter of 1878, he described a man named Elias Cole. Elias had arrived in late October of that year, traveling alone, carrying tools and not much else. He was looking for work, and Thomas had work available, specifically the construction of the inner shelter that Thomas had been planning since the first brutal winter nearly killed his youngest child. Thomas wrote, the best carpenter he had ever seen work, and he had seen a number of good ones. He worked without waste of motion or material. He knew things about stone and wood and the relationship between them that Thomas had not encountered before. And he worked, Thomas noted, as if the thing he was building was going to matter for a long time, which it was. Marion sat with that passage for a long while. The best carpenter he had ever seen work. She thought about Harold at the kitchen table with his plans spread out and his pencil moving in slow, deliberate lines. She thought about the way he had explained to Garrett once, when Garrett was 15, and impatient with detail, that the difference between a structure that lasted and one that did not was almost entirely in the preparation that happened before the first piece of wood was cut. Garrett had been bored by the explanation. Marion had not. She found the loose page on a Wednesday morning in the 6th week. It was folded once and tucked into the back cover of the 4th journal, the one that covered Thomas Whitaker's final recorded year. The paper was heavier than the journal pages, a different stock, and the writing on it was not Thomas's expansive hand, but a smaller, more careful script, the hand of someone accustomed to official documents. It was a land claim record, filed with the Jefferson County Land Office in March of 1882. The claimant's name was Elias Cole. The acreage described was 40 acres along the western slope, and the description of boundaries, written in the precise directional language of 19th century surveying, included the area where Marion was currently sitting. At the bottom was the signature of the county recorder, and beside it a small stamp that indicated the claim had been received and logged. There was no subsequent notation of transfer. No record of the claim being sold or surrendered or abandoned. Just the filing, clean and dated and witnessed. Marion held the page carefully with both hands. The paper had survived 140 years in the back of a leather journal inside a stone room inside a mountain. It was intact. The ink was faded but legible. She folded it along the existing hole crease and put it inside the inner lining of her coat, in the pocket she never used because the zipper had been broken for 3 years and she had never gotten around to fixing it. Now the broken zipper meant the pocket sealed against anything falling out. She thought Harold would have appreciated that particular irony. She did not yet know with certainty what it meant. She was not a lawyer, She did not know Colorado land law from 1882, or how such a claim related to the current ownership of the property above her. But she knew that Elias Cole had been a carpenter from Ohio, and that Harold's family had come from Ohio, and that the man whose name was carved above the inner passage of this cave had filed a legal claim on the land around it, and that no one had ever formally undone that claim. She held that knowledge quietly the way you hold something fragile and kept reading. Outside, 6 weeks had passed since she had walked away from the back porch, and the flyers with her photograph had begun to peel at the corners from weather. Calvin Brooks had been back in Harlan Falls for 3 months when he found her file. He had not wanted to come back. Denver had suited him, the anonymity of it, the sense that a person could be in the process of becoming something without the entire context of their origin watching. He had been 2 years into a journalism program and beginning to understand what kind of reporter he wanted to be when his father had a stroke on a Tuesday morning in November and was gone before the ambulance arrived. His mother was 67 and had never lived alone and was not. Calvin understood someone who could be expected to start, so he had come back. He had taken the position at the Harlan Falls Courier not because it was what he had planned, but because it was what was available, and because being useful to his mother in the evenings required being physically present during the days. The Courier occupied the ground floor of a building on Main Street that smelled permanently of newsprint and old coffee. The archives were kept in a back room with a system of organization that suggested several different people had tried to impose order on it over several decades without any of them knowing what the previous person had done. Calvin was reorganizing the physical files on a Friday afternoon when he found the folder labeled Cole Marion, missing person. The file was thin, a copy of the initial report, Ruth Demby's statement, a summary of the search operation, and a one-paragraph conclusion from the sheriff's office. He read it twice, then he looked at the property transfer records that were public and available through the county assessor's office online, and he noticed what would have been easy to miss if you were not already reading carefully. The sale of the Maplewood Ridge property had been signed and processed with a speed that the standard timeline of Colorado real estate transactions did not support. Normally 2 to 3 weeks minimum for title search, transfer, verification, and recording. This one had been completed in 48 hours, starting from the morning after the missing person report was filed. That was not normal. That was preparation. He drove to Ruth Demby's house the following Monday morning with a notepad and no particular plan beyond listening. Ruth opened the door before he knocked, which suggested she had seen him coming from the window and decided he was worth her time. She poured coffee without asking whether he wanted it and sat down across from him at the kitchen table and looked at him with the assessment of a woman who had spent 20 years in clinical environments, reading people quickly for accuracy. He told her what he had found in the timeline. She told him what she had observed and documented over the previous 6 weeks. By the end of the conversation, she had given him her spiral notebook to photograph every page, and he had given her his cell number and the understanding that he would not publish anything without telling her first. He went to see Garrett the following Thursday. The meeting took place in Garrett's office, a glass and chrome space on the second floor of a building Garrett owned on the main commercial strip. The furniture was expensive and selected to communicate success without ostentation. Garrett greeted him with practiced warmth, the handshake of a man who had learned that the quality of your grip told people what to think about you before you spoke. Calvin said he was working on a piece about the development patterns along the Western Valley slope, the consolidation of properties, the role of outside investment in changing the character of communities like Harlan Falls. He asked about Stonecrest Group and their recent acquisitions. Garrett spoke freely with the confidence of someone who had answered similar questions before and found them manageable. Then Calvin said, "Can you tell me about the Maplewood Ridge property specifically? The one that belonged to your mother?" The quality of the silence that followed was different from the silences that had come before it. Garrett said the property had been part of a family arrangement. He said his mother had been struggling to manage it alone and had agreed that a transition made sense. He said the proceeds had been structured to support her long-term care needs. Calvin wrote this down. Then he asked, "Where is she now?" Garrett said he did not have a current address. He said his mother had chosen not to maintain contact. Calvin looked up from the notepad. He said, "You sold your mother's house and she disappeared the same night, and you do not have a current address for her." Garrett said he understood how that sounded. He said the situation was more complicated than it appeared from the outside. His voice was still controlled, still professional, but something underneath it had shifted the way a foundation shifts before the surface above it shows any change. Calvin thanked him for his time. He stood and buttoned his coat, and then at the door turned back with the specific casualness of a man who has been saving the question he actually came to ask. He said, "Mr. Cole, did your mother ever mention anyone named Elias Cole to you?" Garrett's expression did not change visibly, but he was a full second slower answering than he had been for any previous question. He said the name meant nothing to him. Calvin nodded and left. He drove directly from Garrett's office to the County Historical Society, which shared a building with the public library and kept physical records in a basement archive that was cooled to a temperature that made the filing clerk wear a sweater in July. Calvin spent 4 hours there, and what he found sent him back to his car with his notebook open and his handwriting moving faster than it usually did. Warren Stills had been acquiring properties along the western slope in a pattern that was not random. 7 purchases in 5 years, each one from an owner over the age of 65, each one below assessed market value. Laid out on the county parcel map, the 7 properties formed an imperfect but unmistakable corridor running from the valley floor to the base of the higher terrain. A corridor that pointed specifically at the area locals had always called the Old Whitaker Slope, a section of the mountain that had never been formally developed because its ownership history was in the language of the title company notation Calvin found in one of the older records unresolved. Unresolved. He wrote the word in his notebook and underlined it twice. That was the same week Ruth Denby called him at 7 in the morning and said she had been talking to a retired county surveyor who remembered a conversation years ago about an old land claim in the Jefferson County records that had never been cleared or transferred. A claim from the 1880s. He had not remembered the name attached onto it, but Ruth had asked him to look. Calvin was already driving to the mountain when his phone buzzed with her follow-up message. The name on the claim was Cole. He had been hiking the western slope trails for 2 hours when he found the section of the face that Ruth's surveyor contact had described in his notes, a section that did not appear on any of the standard trail maps below a ridgeline that the marked paths bypassed entirely. He had almost missed the entrance. He had been climbing the ridge itself when his foot slipped on loose shale, and in catching himself, he had looked down the slope and seen what the angle of the late afternoon light had made briefly visible. A dark space in the rock face, too regular in shape to be shadow, too deep. He stood at the entrance with his flashlight and felt the thing that people feel at the edge of a decision that cannot be undone once made. Not fear exactly, awareness. He called into the darkness. He called again. Then he heard something move. Not the sound of a cave settling, not stone or water, or the particular silence of underground space. The sound of a person deliberate and careful, choosing to make themselves heard. He held the light steady and waited. She stepped out of the shadow slowly, and when the light reached her face, Calvin Brooks understood that the story he had been following was not the story he had thought he was following. He had come looking for evidence of a crime. He had come looking for records and timelines and the kind of documentation that assembled itself into an argument. He had found something that did not fit into any of those categories. Marion Cole was alive. She was standing in the entrance of a cave on the western slope of the Harlan Falls Mountains wearing a coat he recognized from the photograph on the missing person flyer, and she was looking at him with the steady, unhurried attention of someone who had been expecting a visitor and was still deciding whether to receive one. She said, "You came alone." It was not a question, it was a test. Calvin said yes. She looked at him for another moment long enough for him to understand that she was not going to be rushed, that the decision she was making was real and considered and entirely hers. Then she said, "I have something inside that you need to see before you write a single word." She turned and went back into the mountain, and Calvin Brooks followed her into the dark. The cave looked different with 2 people in it. Marion noticed this before she noticed anything else. For 15 months, the space had organized itself around her solitude, the dimensions of it calibrated to one person, moving carefully through the dark. Now Calvin Brooks stood near the entrance to the inner chamber with his flashlight angled at the floor out of consideration, and the room felt smaller and more specific as if it had been waiting to be witnessed. She showed him the journals first. All 8 of them arranged in the order she had established months ago, each one resting on the flat stone shelf she had cleared for them along the inner wall. She watched his face as he understood what he was looking at, the shift from professional attention to something unguarded and genuine, the expression of a person encountering something that exceeds the category they brought to receive it. He asked if he could open one. She said yes, but carefully. He handled it the way she had on the first day with both hands, with the instinctive deference people show toward things that have survived longer than expected. He read for a few minutes in silence. Then he looked up. She said Josephine Whitaker, 1871, and nobody knew these existed. Calvin set the journal down with the same care he had used to pick it up. He said nobody knew she existed. That was when Marion took the folded page from inside her coat. She had not shown it to anyone. For 6 weeks, she had carried it against her body and thought about what it meant and what it did not mean and what it might mean to someone with more legal knowledge than she had. She unfolded it now and held it toward his light without releasing it, letting him read without taking it from her hands. She watched his eyes move across the page. She watched them stop and go back to the top and move across it again. He said this is a land claim. She said filed March 1882, Jefferson County, Elias Cole, 40 acres western slope. No transfer on record. Calvin looked up from the page and then at her, and then at the name carved above the inner passage which his flashlight had been pointing at for the past 10 minutes, without him having registered its significance until this moment. Elias Cole. He looked back at her. She said Harold's family came from Ohio. Elias was a carpenter from Ohio. Thomas Whitaker wrote about him in the third journal, the best he had ever seen work. Calvin was quiet for a moment with the specific quality of quiet that meant he was arranging information into structure. Then he said, do you understand what this means for the Stonecrest purchase? She said, I understand it means that Garrett sold something that the legal record suggests may not have been entirely his to sell. They looked at each other in the pale light. She said, I am not a lawyer. I do not know what it means in court, but I know someone who would. Dr. Helen Ashford drove up from Boulder the following week in a green station wagon loaded with archive boxes and a portable humidity monitor and the focused energy of someone who had been waiting for precisely this phone call for longer than she would admit to most people. She was 54 years old and had spent her career studying the settlement patterns of the 19th century American West with the particular passion of a historian who believed that the most important stories were the ones that had been administratively misplaced rather than intentionally buried. Calvin had called her on the strength of 2 published papers she had written about Jefferson County's unresolved land claims from the Homestead Act era. She had answered on the second ring. She stood in the inner chamber of the cave for a long time without speaking. After Marion showed her the journals and the land claim record, the humidity monitor beeped once. She silenced it without looking at it. Then she said in the voice of someone reporting a finding rather than expressing an emotion, I have been trying to locate the Whitaker family records for 12 years. Every county archive I checked listed them as unrecovered. I assumed they had been destroyed in the 1919 courthouse fire. She looked at Marion. She said, you kept them. Marion said, I kept them because they were here and because someone needed to. Ashford turned back to the journals. She said, do you know what Josephine Whitaker's full name was before she married? Marion said she did not. Ashford opened the first journal to the inside back cover where Marion had never thought to look and showed her a small notation in a different ink added at a date clearly later than the surrounding text. It read Josephine Margaret Cole Whitaker, born 1849, Medina County, Ohio. The room was very quiet. Marion said she was a Cole before she married. Ashford said Elias was almost certainly her brother, which means the land claim was a family holding, which means the chain of title on this acreage has never been legally closed. She looked at the land claim document with the careful attention of someone who understood exactly what she was holding. Then she said, I know a property rights attorney in Denver who has been waiting for a case like this for 20 years. His name is Raymond Cutler, and he does not lose cases involving historical title disputes because he treats each one as if the person who originally held the claim is still present and still owed something. She pulled out her phone. She said, do I have your permission to call him right now? Marion said yes. Raymond Cutler arrived 3 days later, driving himself in a 10-year-old sedan and carrying a single briefcase that he handled with the reverence of a surgeon with a preferred instrument. He was 61 years old, lean and quiet, with the unhurried manner of a man who had learned that the cases worth taking required patience, measured in months rather than days. He spent 2 hours in the cave with the documents, asking Marion questions in a sequence that she understood was not casual, but was the architecture of an argument being built in real time. At the end of the 2 hours, he said, I cannot promise you a specific outcome. What I can tell you is that this claim was properly filed, was never transferred or extinguished, and sits on 40 acres that include approximately 11 of the 32 acres Stonecrest Group purchased from your son 8 months ago. The title company that processed that transaction should have caught this. They did not, or they chose not to look. He paused. He said, "What do you want from this?" Marion had been thinking about that question since the night she found the land claim page. She had thought about it in the way you think about a question that matters too much to answer quickly. She said, "I want the cave and the land around it designated as a protected historical site. I want the Whitaker journals to stay here accessible to historians properly preserved. I want it on record that Elias Cole built something that lasted and that it mattered." Cutler wrote this down, he said, in the Stonecrest parcel. She said, "That is your problem to solve." He almost smiled. He said, "I can work with that." Warren Stills received Raymond Cutler's letter on a Thursday morning and called Garrett Cole before noon. The call lasted 11 minutes. Garrett knew this because he looked at his phone afterward, and the duration was displayed there: 11 minutes and 43 seconds. The length of a conversation in which a person's understanding of their situation changes completely, and they are left holding a device that has just delivered the news. Stills was not angry in the way that people are angry when they have been wronged. He was angry in the way that people are angry when they have been made to look careless, which was for a man like Stills considerably worse. He said the title search his company had commissioned should have revealed the coal claim. He said it had not. He said this created a liability that he was not willing to absorb on behalf of a transaction that Garrett had represented as clean. He said the word clean the way a person says a word they intend to echo. Garrett said he had not known about the claim. This was true. It did not help him. Stills said his legal team would be in contact regarding the terms of unwinding the transaction. He said the phrase "unwinding the transaction" with the flat precision of a man who had unwound transactions before and found them unpleasant but manageable. He said the amount Garrett would need to return, including Stonecrest's carrying costs and legal fees, would be communicated in writing. Garrett sat in his office after the call ended and looked at the surface of his desk for a long time. He had spent 8 months telling himself a story about the Maplewood Ridge transaction, a story in which he had made a difficult decision for practical reasons, in which his mother's inability to manage the property had made action necessary, in which the outcome, while imperfect, had been the responsible choice available to him. He had told that story so many times that it had acquired the texture of memory, the feeling of something that had actually happened, rather than something that had been constructed. Sitting at his desk, with Stills' voice still present in the room, the story lost its texture. He thought about the folder with the colored tabs. He thought about the way his mother had looked at him when she asked whether a contract had already been signed, the way she had absorbed the answer in his pause rather than his words. He thought about the 2 words he had spoken into the phone when Penny called "done now," and the way those 2 words had seemed efficient at the time and now seemed like a different kind of record. He called Penny that afternoon. She answered on the first ring, which meant she had been waiting for it. He said, "We need to go see her." Penny was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I know." He said, "She may not want to see us." Penny said, "That is not something we get to decide." They drove separately to the mountain, which was not planned, but which neither of them addressed. Garrett arrived first and waited at the trailhead for 20 minutes until Penny's car pulled in beside his. They did not speak much on the hike up. The silence between them was not comfortable, but it was honest, which was more than most of their recent silences had been. Calvin had told Marion they were coming. He had called ahead because he believed she deserved the choice of how to receive them, and because he had spent enough time with her by now to understand that she made her best decisions when they were entirely her own. She was standing outside the cave entrance when they came around the last turn of the trail, not waiting in the sense of anticipation. Standing the way she stood when she was thinking, weight evenly distributed hands at her sides, her attention directed at the middle distance. Penny stopped when she saw her. The sound she made was not a word. Garrett stopped beside his sister. For the first time in the 8 months since he had placed a folder on a kitchen table and changed the shape of everything, he looked at his mother without the mediation of a plan or a justification or a prepared response. He looked at her the way you look at something you thought you had accounted for and understand suddenly that you had not. Marion looked at them both. She said, "You came." Garrett said, "We needed to." She studied him. She said, "Needed to or were told to?" He did not answer immediately. The pause was its own kind of honesty. He said both, and then mostly needed to. She nodded once. She looked at Penny. Penny said, "Mom." Just that word. The single syllable of it carrying the weight of everything she had not said for 8 months, the phone calls that had grown shorter, the call she had made on the night of the folder, and the 2 words she had heard in response and had not followed with a single question about where her mother was. Marion said, "Come inside." They sat in the inner chamber, the four of them, because Calvin was there too, sitting to one side with his notebook closed on his knee, present as a witness rather than a reporter. The journals were on their shelf. The name Elias Cole was above the passage. The land claim page was folded inside Marion's coat. Garrett spoke first. He said he had not known about the land claim. He said the transaction had been structured to be clean and that he had believed it was. He said he understood that these facts did not change what he had done. Marion said, "Tell me what you think you did." It was a question that required something different from an explanation. Garrett was quiet for a moment with the stillness of a man encountering a question he cannot answer with the tools he has been using. Then he said, "I decided that what you had built was an asset rather than a life, and I treated you the same way." The chamber was very quiet. Penny said, "I knew the night it was happening and I said nothing after. I told myself I thought you would be all right. I told myself the arrangement made sense." She stopped. She said, "I didn't ask where you were. For 8 months I didn't ask because asking would have meant acknowledging what I already knew." Marion listened to both of them. She did not fill the silence that followed with reassurance or acceleration toward resolution. She let it sit the way the cave let silence sit without urgency. She said, "You are both telling me the truth right now. That matters." She said, "It does not undo what happened. You should understand that clearly. There is a version of this story where I walked toward that motel and became someone you could continue to manage. And the fact that I did not walk toward it is the only reason we are sitting here. The grace in this room did not come from you." Garrett said, "I know." She said, "What happens now is not something I am going to arrange for you. You came here looking for something, a resolution, a permission, something that would make the weight of this easier to carry. I am not able to give you that. What you did with what you had is something you will have to account for in your own time and in your own way." She paused. She said, "But I will tell you this. Your grandfather built something in this mountain 140 years ago, and nobody knew it was here until I needed it to be. That is what it means to build something that lasts, not that everyone sees it, that it is there when it is needed." She looked at Garrett specifically. She said, "You know how to build things. You have always known how. The question is whether you build them to last or build them to sell." He did not answer, but he heard it. Raymond Cutler filed the historical preservation petition with Jefferson County 3 weeks later. The petition documented the Whitaker journals, the land claim, the connection between Elias Cole and the Whitaker family, and the continuous presence of the materials in the original location. It requested that the 40-acre parcel be designated a protected historical site under Colorado's Heritage Preservation Act, restricting commercial development in perpetuity. Dr. Ashford submitted a supporting affidavit that ran to 14 pages and cited 7 comparable precedents. She described the Whitaker journals as the most significant unrecovered primary source document collection relating to 19th century Jefferson County settlement to have surfaced in 40 years. She described their condition as remarkable. She described their preservation as the result of what she called sustained and deliberate human care under extraordinarily difficult circumstances, and she attributed that care to Marion Cole without elaboration because the facts were sufficient and elaboration would have diminished them. Stonecrest Group settled with Raymond Cutler's office 4 days before the county hearing. The terms were not made public, but the result was that 11 acres of the parcel reverted to the Historical Preservation Trust that Cutler had established on Marion's behalf, and the remaining acreage of the original Stonecrest purchase was released back to Garrett Cole at the acquisition price minus Stonecrest's costs. The development project, which Stills had described in his initial filing as a mixed-use recreational destination, was withdrawn. Garrett received a check that was considerably smaller than the one he had deposited 8 months ago. He did not contest the terms. The county hearing was held on a Wednesday morning in late October. The chamber held 40 seats and had standing room for another 20. By the time the session opened, people were standing in the hallway outside. Ruth Demby sat in the second row. She had brought her spiral notebook, though she did not open it. Some records did not need to be kept in writing. Calvin Brooks sat at the press table with his recorder running and his notebook open. He had been working on the full account for 2 months, and the piece he was writing was longer and more careful than anything the Harlan Falls Courier had published in its 40-year history. He had already received an inquiry from a Denver publication about regional rights. He had not told Marion about this yet because he was still deciding how to frame it, which he understood was its own kind of answer. Dr. Ashford sat in the front row with two colleagues from the university, both of whom had been working with her on the journal preservation project for the past 6 weeks. The originals would remain in the cave in the conditions that had preserved them for 140 years, accessible to qualified researchers under protocols that Ashford had drafted herself. Archival photographs of every page were being processed in Boulder. Penny Cole sat near the back of the room alone. She had come without telling Garrett. She was not certain why she had come, or rather she was certain, but could not yet say it plainly, which was something she was working on. Garrett did not attend. This was his choice, and Marion understood it as such. His absence was not cowardice. It was the acknowledgement that his presence would shift the story's center of gravity toward him, and for once in his life, he was choosing not to do that. The county commissioners heard the petition. Ashford presented her affidavit. Cutler presented the legal argument. A local historian presented a brief supplementary statement about the significance of the Whitaker records to the documented history of Jefferson County settlement. Then the chair of the commission asked whether the petitioner wished to address the board. Marion stood. She had not prepared remarks in any formal sense. She had thought about what mattered and what did not, and she had decided that the only thing worth saying was the thing she actually believed, which was a simpler standard than most people applied to public speech, but a more demanding one. She said, "I want to say something about Josephine Whitaker before I say anything about myself." The room was quiet. She said Josephine wrote 8 journals across 9 years in conditions that gave her very few reasons to believe anyone would ever read them. She wrote because the life she was living deserved to be recorded, and because she understood, I think, that a life lived without any record of it is a life that the world can erase as if it never happened. She was right about that. I know she was right because I spent 15 months in the place she helped build, and I read every word she wrote, and she is more present to me now than people I have known for decades. She paused. She said, "I want to say something about Elias Cole, who was Josephine's brother, and who filed a legal claim on this land in 1882 and built something inside this mountain that stood for 140 years without anyone knowing it was there. Elias was a carpenter. He built things to last. He signed his name into the stone above the room he built, not as a boast, but as a record, as a way of saying, I was here and what I made is real." She said, "I am asking this board to protect that room and the land around it, not because of what it is worth, but because of what it means. It means that ordinary people who were never famous and never powerful and never acknowledged built things that outlasted everything that tried to erase them." She looked at the commissioners. She said, "I would know something about that." There was a silence in the room that had a different quality from the silence of people waiting. It was the silence of people who had received something and were holding it. The commission voted unanimously. Afterward, outside the building, the autumn light was doing what it did in Colorado in late October, coming in low and amber, laying itself across the mountain faces with the generosity of something that knows it is nearly finished for the year. People stood in small groups in the parking lot talking quietly. Ruth Demby found Marion near the edge of the lot, away from the clusters. Ruth said, "I never stopped looking." Marion said, "I know you didn't." Ruth said, "I want you to know that I did it because of you, not because of what you represented or what your case meant as a matter of justice. I did it because you are my friend, and I was not willing to accept that you were gone." Marion looked at her. She said, "That is the kindest thing anyone has said to me in a long time, and I have had some good things said to me recently." They stood together for a moment in the low light. Calvin came to find her before she left. He said the piece was almost finished, and he wanted her to read it before it went to print. She said she trusted him to tell it accurately. He said he wanted her to see it anyway, not to approve it, but because she had been inside it, and the people inside a story deserved to see its shape. She said, "You came up that mountain alone. You brought a notebook instead of a camera. Those 2 choices told me everything I needed to know about your intentions. Finish the piece the way you started it." He said, "The Denver publication wants to run it." She said, "Good. Josephine Whitaker has been waiting long enough." He smiled at that. It was a real smile, not performed, and she noted it because she had come to understand that Calvin Brooks was a person who did not perform emotions as a default, which was rarer than people acknowledged. She walked back toward her car. Penny was leaning against the passenger door, not looking at her phone, just standing there with the particular stillness of someone who has decided to be present rather than occupied. They looked at each other. Penny said, "I am going to do better. I do not know exactly what that looks like yet, but I am going to figure it out. Marion said, I believe you. She said it without qualification or warmth, as strategy, as a plain statement of assessment. She believed her daughter was capable of doing better. Whether she did was a separate question, and it was Penny's question to answer, not hers to manage. She got in her car and drove to the base of the trail. She left the car unlocked, which she had stopped doing years ago and had started doing again recently because it seemed to her that the category of things worth protecting had clarified itself considerably over the past 15 months. She put on her coat. She checked the small flashlight on her keychain, which still had power. She climbed. The mountain received her the way it always did, without comment, without accommodation, without the particular performance of welcome that people offered when they wanted something from you. It was simply there, old and indifferent and entirely reliable, which was more than she could say for most things she had counted on. She went through the entrance. She went through the passage. She came into the inner chamber where the humidity monitor Ashford had installed blinked a small green light in the corner, and the journals sat in their archival housings on the stone shelf, and the name Elias Cole was above the passage, exactly as it had been for 140 years. She sat down on the flat stone she had cleared in the third week, the one positioned to catch the angle of morning light from the entrance crack, the one that had become, without planning or ceremony, her place. She put her hand against the cold wall beside her. There was a thing she had been trying to articulate for months, since before Calvin had found her, since before she had understood the full shape of what she was sitting in the middle of. She had not found the words for it in any of her journal entries. She had not been able to say it to Ashford or Calvin or Ruth, though each of them had come close to it from different angles. She thought she understood it now. Garrett had wanted to erase her, not out of hatred, which would have been legible and almost easier to bear, but out of the simple, practical decision that she had become a thing, taking up space where something more valuable could exist. He had wanted to write her out of the story, of the property, of the family, of the daily accounting of people who mattered. And in trying to erase her, he had sent her into the mountain. And in the mountain she had found Josephine, who had refused to disappear. And Elias, who had carved his name into stone because he understood that the world would not remember him otherwise. And Thomas, who had written with the expansive confidence of a man who believed his life was significant and had been right, though it had taken 140 years for the proof to arrive. They had all been trying to be remembered, not famous, not celebrated, simply not erased. She had been trying the same thing she understood now for her entire adult life in the house Harold had built in the library, where she had cataloged other people's records for 14 years, in every meal and every school pickup, and every quiet act of maintenance that a family required and rarely noticed. She had been leaving records of herself in the only materials available to her, which were the lives of the people she loved. The difference now was this: the record she was leaving was her own. She opened the journal she had been writing in, the newest one, the one Ashford had brought her from Boulder, acid-free pages and a cover the color of the rock walls around her. She picked up the pen. She wrote today, "The county voted to protect this place." Josephine would have been matter-of-fact about it, I think. She would have noted the weather and the temperature of the room and whether the commissioners looked like men who understood what they were voting on. I think some of them did. She wrote, "I am going to stay here through the winter. In the spring, I will begin working with Helen on the full documentation of the journals. There is work to do, and I am the person best positioned to do it, and I have found at 72 years old that having work you are best positioned to do is not a small thing." She wrote, "Harold built this house, I used to say. I meant the one on Maplewood Ridge. I was wrong about which house I meant." She closed the journal. The green light of the humidity monitor blinked steadily in the corner. Outside, the October light was failing the mountain, going quiet in the way it went quiet at the end of a day, not with drama, but with the patient certainty of something that has been here long before any of this and expects to be here long after. Marion Cole sat in the room that Elias had built and Josephine had filled and time had preserved, and her son had tried to make irrelevant, and she was not erased. She was exactly where she had chosen to be.